Hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk about video game genres and the kind of arbitrary nature that they exist in. So I just want to go through a few of these with you and just kind of realize a lot of these don't make sense because a game really should be defined by the verb and the action of the game and not much else. So the first example on the list is of course Metroidvania, which is a combination of Metroid and Vania, and Castlevania rather. And so these two genres of games are there are 2D action side scrollers that both involve backtracking. And it's a very odd thing to refer to a game as just another game. You know, there's nothing so inexplicable about something that it has to refer to the identity of something else in order for you to get a good idea of what it is. So for a long time, there were Doom likes, and even saying that term, when we want to say an approximation to another identity or product or style, we could say, you know, Doom-esque, Doom-like, Doom clone. But Doom is an FPS, and we didn't really have the language at the time to know what that was. And Stuart Brown just did a fantastic video on that, on the genre term defining it. And it didn't come around until it was many years later, and then it didn't get mass adoption until much, much later. So Doom as an FPS, and all the other games that were inspired by it, that are Doom-likes or Doom clones, so there's one method of naming something that is very similar to Metroidvania, where you just refer to another completely wholly new identity, which I really don't agree with. Doom is an FPS, so in that case, what is a game like Super Metroid or Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Well, if you really look at it, it's a 2D action adventure side scroller. But then again, let's reduce side scroller because it's really just a 2D action adventure game. And you could just leave it at that. It's a 2D action adventure game. I think that's where most games actually exist in that genre. And my favorite games are action adventure games, where it's really difficult how you break up the gameplay into specific kind of mechanics. So, for example, if I were to build a game, and I've thought about this, you know, you have to explore the environment. So exploration is number one. The next thing that usually comes is two, which is discovery. So if there are things to find and collect in the environment, then that's discovery. It's not like you're just going through and you just go from point A to point B, but then there's side roads and side paths and options for the player to be like, oh, I'm going to go over here and see something. And if the player goes over there and they see something, actually get something for their curiosity, it means they're rewarded for it. One game that I think that does discovery really well, but also extremely poorly because it doesn't actually reward you, is Shadow of the Colossus. Because in Shadow of the Colossus, you have these sections of the map that you have no reason to go to, and they were planning to have way more colossi in the original game, so it makes sense why you have these big empty areas and these areas of the map that seem like you should go to them, but you have no reason to. And those areas of the map, they have nothing in them. Maybe like a save point, that's kind of weird, but there's nothing there that rewards the player. There's no collectible, there's no pickup, there's no upgrade. It just exists as empty space. And empty space in a video game is kind of like a design sin. If there's nothing to see, let alone nothing to do, that's a really big issue. But in Shadow of the Colossus, because it's such a mysterious game, it kind of adds to the mystery of the game, even though it was intended to be filled with things. Because you know it was supposed to be intended to be filled with things, the discovery of it and the absence of something is very odd and very kind of awe-inspiring. But at the same token, yeah, it's not a good gameplay decision to have a bunch of empty space with nothing in it. So, okay. So when we have the character moving through the environment, so that's exploration, they're finding stuff, that's discovery, and then you have combat. And so, you know, it's funny that walking simulator, I think, might fall into the exploration only point. They just start at the bottom, They might have some collectibles in them, but then you have the next piece, which is combat action. So in Zelda, you can explore the overworld, but you can also fight enemies and stuff. And so the fighting of the enemies, that's a whole new other function that adds on top of that whole structure. And now you have 3 different kind of actions. There are different types of ways to dispatch foes using your items, weapons, etc. And also on top of that, it's interesting because there are other games that kind of do this same process. They have the same building blocks, but the focus is on the action part, the third, kind of building part. Things like Ninja Gaiden or Devil May Cry, yes, there's an environment. Yes, are collectibles and pickups and stuff, but that's really not the main focus. When they sat down to design this thing, they thought this is going to be an action game. And so we now start to have a differentiation between these basic gameplay elements that you have a world and a character and other enemies in it. And that's kind of like the basics for a typical game. And then it just might differentiate along the lines of what you focus on. So in Zelda's case, it's more of an adventure game, which means it's more about puzzle solving. Well, honestly, everything that's non-combat. Combat is a component of it, but it's not the main component. Something like Devil May Cry, it absolutely is the main component. You are there to fight guys. And it's interesting how you can almost predict what it's going to be like. For example, Devil May Cry, they have a world and they have a story and they care about the story, but they don't really care about the world. I mean, the environments are nice, but the number one thing about that game that always kind of irked me as someone who wasn't used to action games is that the entire world was a series of levels and missions separated by load screens. In a case like Zelda, you are in the world. There is no menu interface. Yes, there's a main menu. Yes, there's a pause menu, but the way you actually interface with the world and the environment is through the world itself. While in Devil May Cry, you kind of have this menu that is kind of the god of the Devil May Cry world. Like, you can't go to a new mission unless you navigate through these menus. Rather than in Zelda, you go through a doorway or a portal and you go. And the only kind of exit is when you quit the game. And then you go to the main menu. But once you're immersed in that world, you are in that world. Skyrim, same thing. There are no, besides the upgrade menu, there are no menus that are barring you from entering that game. Once you're in there, unless you have a terrible loading screen or something. So in Devil May Cry, so it's I think when we talk about the differentiation between action games and adventure games, one of the main factors is how it focuses on the world. How can I interact with the world? Is the world even important? Are there even people in the world? In Devil May Cry, there are no NPCs. There's only enemies. You can't talk in a Devil May Cry game, except for like 5. And maybe in 4 somewhere, but for most of it, you're not talking, you're not exploring, really. Actually, we'll take that back. There is some discovery, and there is an exploration is necessary to progress through the level. I mean, it would be pretty bleak if Devil May Cry was just one room and enemies just spawned in it. That'd be very lame. No, you have to go through obstacles and trials and stuff in different environments. And there's also exploration there, discovery, where you jump on top of a statue and you find a bunch of red orbs. But again, all of these things take a backseat to the fact that it's action focused. That's why you're there. In Zelda, there's also action there, but it's not the main focus. The overall story and characters and world are the focus. It's a much more broader brushstroke, which makes it a much more engaging game for me. It has a lot of variety of gameplay, and I find that my favorite games like Nier, where suddenly you have a hack and slash and then it goes top-down view without any load screens, and suddenly you're playing a kind of bullet hell shooter game. It's really interesting how they're able to mesh all those different mechanics and mini games, almost different gameplay styles, into one holistic identity. And I really, really just end up being gravitated and enjoying those games because uh, it's one of those sayings where the sum is different than the whole. The whole is different than the parts, which is a lot of people say that the sum is greater than the parts, but no, it's the actual code is the sum is different than the parts. And in that case, I think it's obviously greater and different in its execution. And it can be very hard, I guess, for non-gamers to really understand that, because if you see someone playing for a few minutes, they're like, they conceptualize what you are doing. Oh, he's shooting this thing and now he's fighting this monster. But when you put all those things together along with the dialogue and the characters, because you're sitting there engaged with it, the whole experience overall has a greater effect than just all these tiny little experiences that, if you were to watch them, seem almost disconjuncted from one another and have no driving cohesive narrative, which is very much the opposite. Games like Nier and Zelda, and even some of the Sonic games like Adventure 2 that have a variety of gameplay, do this very well. So there's one aspect where you have the focus of the game, action adventure, and so I would say Zelda is an action adventure game. If there was no combat, it would only be an adventure game, which would be really weird. I don't know what kind of game would be like that. I could think of maybe like some walking simulators and things like that. It's very cheap, low budget games or story based games. But without combat, it makes it feel less, I don't know, less real, less impactful. So action adventure is kind of the main genre. And so I would say Super Metroid and Castlevania are 2D action adventure games. And then I thought about it, there are certain verbs about what you're doing. Well, in Zelda, you're adventuring. It's an adventure game. In Devil May Cry Ninja Gaiden, you're doing action. And by the way, that's the other thing. Another one on my list here that I really have an issue with is the term character action game. Every single game has a character that is performing an action. It is a stupid term. It is such a stupid term. Just call it an action game. If it's focused on combat and gameplay more than any other aspect, it's an action game. Okay? That's kind of, the first thing that I want to get out there. Another one I have an issue with is immersive sim, which has been used to describe games like System Shock, which I've played recently. I find that to be a super odd term. First of all, every game should be immersive. If your game is not immersive, what are you doing? You've failed as a game creator. Your games should be immersive, and they should be. That's kind of like a basic requirement. It's like saying a video immersive game for a video game. Like, we know we're playing a video game. So that's kind of implied. And number two is the sim part. Well, the sim part is short for simulation. And there's nothing really about System Shock that's a sim. It's an RPG. It's an action RPG is what System Shock really is. It's like calling it an immersive sim. I mean, I can understand in an era of gaming where games were not immersive, and then they were in the late 90s-ish. But to just call it immersive sim is just like calling a food a mouth eater. It's just like, you don't need to say that. It's such a dumb term. So yeah, System Shock, immersive sim, it's an action RPG. It has RPG elements and it's basically action based. And there's a lot of, so I would say maybe action adventure RPG, but at that point you just call it an RPG. But it also feels weird to call a game like System Shock, which is sci-fi, just an RPG. So you could call it a sci-fi RPG, but in traditional RPG standards, again, the type of gameplay you expect is turn-based or and I guess on Metroid and Castlevania quickly. The one kind of thing people talk about it is if we're defining games by verbs, you backtrack in those games. So you could call it a backtracker or a backtrack game, I suppose. But that's kind of a funny thing I thought of. I don't think you should actually do that. But when we look at those games and the aspects and components of it, I think 2D action adventure is sufficient for what that is and describes what it's about. There's also the term side scroller, which, I mean, what 2D game isn't a side scroller? I mean, I think there are a few rare ones, but they're very, very old and probably not very popular. Mario is a 2D side scroller. In fact, Mario, would you call it an adventure game? Would you call it an action game? Technically, it's an exploration game where you have to get to the end. The original Mario. Kind of a tough one. I would say I would hesitate, but I would say 2D action adventure as well. Even though you can only move in one direction, you still are exploring. There are secrets. There's combat technically when you're jumping and avoiding enemies, and I think that's pretty much the basic stuff. So yeah. Then there's also 4X strategy games like I'm not sure if Valkyria Chronicles would fall into that category, but it's been used to describe XCOM. And so yeah, you have like the strategy on the ground where you have your units and you're positioning them according to the other enemies in the map, and it's a very strategic game. But then outside of that, there's also upgrading your guys, and there's another strategic game being played on the world map, similar to Battlefront 2 for those who aren't familiar with it. And so to call that a 4X, which I think is for extermination, extraction, and two other things, exploration. I think just a strategy game would be sufficient. I think any game where it's essentially turn-based could be a strategy game. And maybe because we're just used to the term RPG, we're just used to the whole take turns thing, just be called a RPG, rather than a strategy game, which is more likely. And this brings us, of course, to the big elephant in the room, which is RPG, role-playing game. Which makes me realize if I've ever called a game an RPG game, that's a role-playing game, which is not. So, the entire concept around an RPG is very obscure, I guess, because technically every game you are playing a role as a character. I know I'm not that character, and I'm playing. I don't know. It's very nuanced and funny, I guess, in that aspect. But yeah, RPG doesn't really mean anything. But what we associate it with are a set of rules that are more akin to Dungeons and Dragons, which is a role-playing game that, in a pen and paper kind of way, it's very obvious. Oh, this is a board game or a kind of, again, a tabletop game where I'm playing as a certain character and I'm assuming a role. And so there are certain cutoff points where what is an RPG and what isn't an RPG. People have said for a long time that back in the day, Ocarina was an RPG. And it's like, I mean, you do upgrade your health, and I guess technically you have stats, but it's very different from something like Final Fantasy VII, its competitor at the time, and something like Fallout. Fallout, I think, is a much more well-defined RPG that is not in a medieval fantasy setting. So I think, because I think a lot of people would look at Fallout and they would say that's an RPG. And the reason they would say that is there's a very heavy emphasis and transparency on your stats. When you start the game, you have certain stats, you have skill stats, and your kind of base character stats like strength, which determines all of your skill stats, and so on and so forth down the line. So I think an RPG is any game that really emphasizes or is transparent about its stat-based nature, where if you could almost play this game pen and paper, then maybe it defines itself as an RPG. Even in Fallout, it's funny that it's a live time, real time, first person shooter and third person shooter, and VATS acts as a way to slow down the combat, which gives you the advantage of a turn-based shooter, which is, again, it's a really cool idea, and I really enjoy how they combine so many things and it just worked really, really well. But with Final Fantasy VII, that's a game where, again, you're not creating your own character. In Fallout and Skyrim, you can make an Argonian Nerevar. You can make a Khajiit Dragonborn. You can do all these things that, while the main story doesn't really change, even though maybe it should, they all kind of work in the sense that it doesn't matter who you make. It's that your character is your character. You're making that character. In Final Fantasy VII, even though you can rename Cloud to whatever you want, everyone knows that that is Cloud. And when you play Final Fantasy VII, it has a default name for every character. So unless you want to call them something really stupid and funny, that's Cloud, that's Spirit, that's Tifa, and there's no getting around that. And in that case, you're not really making your own character. You're assuming a role of a character, but you're not making a character. So the whole term role playing, again, it applies more so to the games that aren't RPGs than the ones that are. If I'm making a character, I'm not playing a role, I'm creating a role. It should be called a role creating game, an RCG, which is not going to catch on. While every other game is technically an RPG because you're playing as someone else. Or a character creator game, I don't know. But the point is that the term RPG is very, I would say, divorced in a big way from what the actual actions and aspects of the game are. Just as language and actions and culture evolve, we fail to have the ability to accurately represent new things, and so we just kind of throw these labels back onto these new things, which we know, it's not technically true, but I don't have a new word to coin for this thing. And so, we've just gotten to this point where either we make up new language or we redefine or re-examine our language and how we define and label and describe things so that we get a better idea of what they are. So for RPG, that one just doesn't really work. I think another one, a good example, just jumping off that, is another one that I thought about, which was survival horror. So survival horror and horror, those are two different genres. But again, what is the verb? At least in a role-playing game, it's telling you that you are playing a role. There's a verb that you're assuming a character. You're playing as someone else. Even though it's inaccurate, it's still telling you a verb. Horror, though, that's not a verb. That's a subject matter. And survival, well, that's technically a verb, I guess. But it's also an idea as well. That's survival and surviving, two of the same things. And so I thought about, okay, well, there's Resident Evil, obviously. There is Silent Hill. And then there are games like Five Nights at Freddy's. And so you kind of realize, well, technically these are all horror games, but they're really, really different. And even when you look at the survival part, I think that function or that aspect of the game is that you have limited resources. That's the survival component, and that tension that not only are the enemies scary, the environments are scary, but you have low resources to deal with that scariness. And as you go through the game, you get upgrade, etc., you are able to deal with it more efficiently and effectively. So, and I realized this when I recently played Dead Space 3, and they just load you up with ammo and health. You have no feeling of danger when you were playing Dead Space 3, especially if you play with someone else. It's kind of ridiculous how easy that game is. And so I guess what really defines the survival genre is that you have limited resources. And so when you don't have limited resources, it just becomes, well, what's Dead Space 3 without limited resources? It's an action TPS. It's a third-person shooter. No one ever says TPS, but third-person shooter, I guess, works because there's so few of them. But it's an action game, really. It is an action game, and it's really weird that when you take away that one aspect of the game, even though it's called survival horror, that survival thing does not hold up. The other aspect then, is it just a horror game? Well, I mean, honestly, if things are just jumping out and screaming at you and you gun them down, no, that's an action game. There has to actually there has to be a thing that actually scares you, and then it's more of a general or specific question then, what is scary? And if something is scary to someone and it's not to someone else, does that count? I think another perfect example of a horror game would be PT. That is specifically designed to unnerve the player, but there are no resources. There is no survival element. It's a bunch of puzzles. And so you could say that's an adventure game, but just in a different mode or mood that is supposed to intimidate and scare the player and unnerve them. But you think about something like Five Nights at Freddy's, that's something where you're not exploring or doing anything. You're just playing, not even like a puzzle. You're actually, technically, I guess you're playing a resource game because it's survival, because you have limited resources of your energy and time. And so you're actually trying to make the time run down while you conserve your energy and also monitor the cameras. And so I realized, what's the main aspect and function of this game? It's not really supposed to unnerve you. This is a Silent Hill where you have a weird sound or a weird image that you can't really tell, that it's red blotches and it looks like some horrific scene, but you also can't make it out precisely. And in Five Nights at Freddy's, the horror comes from the tension of the animatronics coming towards you, and then they jump scare you. That's the actual scary part. So I guess you could argue it's a survival game, kind of, but really you're just being jump scared. It's not actually horrifying. And I guess games like Resident Evil are not actually horrifying, but Silent Hill really does try to unnerve and make you feel uncomfortable. And so I was just compelled to say that we could call Five Nights at Freddy's a jump scare game, which I think as the verbiage, because you're getting jump scared and it's a survival jump scare game, horrendous as that sounds, it's more accurate to what that game is than talking about it as a horror game. There's no horror, there's just jump scares. Yeah, and the same thing could be said of Slender and the rest of them. So yeah, it's really the verbiage that constitutes what you call a certain game. If you're adventuring, if you're doing action, if you are getting jump scared, if you are surviving. Of course, I mean, the ultimate game that stood to mind was a game like Don't Starve, which is literally a survival game. It's about getting enough material so that you don't die in the night. And it is not really meant to be scary. It's supposed to be kind of Tim Burton-y scary, a little bit unnerving. And in the context of that game, I thought, well, this is a purely strict survival game. Yeah, it has a bit of a story, something like The Long Dark. These small sort of story-driven games where you have limited resources. These are all survival games that tell a certain story. So I guess you could call them adventure games, but because it focuses so much on limited resources, you could call it survival, I think. Or survival adventure doesn't sound correct, because you're not having an adventure if you're just stay alive. And then that led me to other games where there are aspects of, I talked about recently, or earlier rather, about aspects of games that are non-combat and focus on action and adventure, more so adventure with not so much action. And the one thing that comes to mind is, well, Minecraft. Minecraft also could be argued to be a survival game because you are just trying to survive and build a house and build shelter. And, from when Minecraft came out to what it is now, it's a very different game from a game that was very kind of atmospheric and I mean, the soundtrack to Minecraft is, I would say, pretty impressive, creating a certain mood, but also having this very functional universe where you can have this low poly Lego esque crafting building game. And so while there are enemies you can fight, really it's about exploring the world and creating some sort of universe or some sort of survivalist thing out of it. So I would say Minecraft, when it came out, was a survival game, and now it's more of a well, I mean, it was a creative sandbox, and it always was that, but it felt more like a survival game because they just plop you in and expect you to figure things out if you don't know how to craft or whatever. And so, a survival sandbox game, I guess that's technically what it is. And sandbox is a term that I think is very appropriate, even though it's not a verb. It's kind of being used. I know. Can you sandbox something? He's a sandboxer. It sounds a little bit funny, but that pretty much is what you're doing in those kinds of games that really focus on crafting and creativity, where initially there's not a point to the game. If it's just simply you expressing yourself using the palette and the canvas of the game, then I would say that is a sandbox game. Or it'd be odd to call it a painting game because you're building things, but it's some game where you are just expressing yourself. An expression game? I don't know. But I mean that's Minecraft, I guess. So it's part survival, part customization and crafting. And I think it's a really good mix because you have the world and you can discover stuff in it as well, and you can explore it, and you can use that to better create and build things. And so yeah, I guess that would constitute as a survival game, really, to me. But it has those other aspects of it too. So it's hard to really pin it down. And with the really great games or really popular games, sometimes it's very hard to pin down exactly what they are. Speaking of great games, when you have a really well-established game like Metroid and Castlevania, you get and Doom, you got copycats. And so I just did write down a few of the funny like genres that you find where someone's trying to describe something and they just completely fail, and they say, well, it's like this other game. So you have things like obviously roguelikes. Was it a Fallout was called originally Oblivion with guns? So they just took their other game that they made and said, oh, they added guns to this. The Halo Killer, the Zelda clone, and so on. And those are the main ones that I could think of where people just ascribed it to something else. And a lot of companies would set out to create a killer or a clone, and I think pretty much every single one of them failed. I don't think Call of Duty 4 ever set out to be a Halo killer. It did become a Halo killer, I think, in the long run, simply because they weren't really trying to compete with Halo. They were just doing their own thing. They're doing a modern military shooter, not at all like Halo. And I feel like a lot of people who do try to copy certain things just never end up working. I think Dark Cloud has been called a Zelda clone. I think, what was it? The first, the Doomsday game. Oh, Darksiders. Darksiders was called a Zelda killer, I think. And so that really turned me off. But yeah, every time a game is set up, and Darksiders, I guess it didn't completely die and fail, but I also played it and said, yeah, this is not really a Zelda-like game. Kind of. It's more like God of War, honestly, than Zelda, because you do have minimal puzzles, mostly focus on combat. But I don't know if I would actually call it an action game. I mean, God of War, the original, it definitely is an action-adventure game with more emphasis on action for sure, but all of that work put into the world and the puzzles and the level design, it's kind of hard to ignore that. And so I think it is fair to call that an action-adventure game. There's so many upgrades and other things like that. And then you have the whole sort of shooter subgenre where you have first-person shooters, third-person shooters. But if someone just says it's a shooter, a lot of people might be biased to say, oh, you mean a first-person shooter. But if someone says, if we're talking about the whole of gaming, saying just a shooter, I think, oh, that might be like one of those classic 2D top-down Galaga-like shooters, where they didn't have them call them top-down shooters because those are the only shooters available. Also, third-person shooter is a weird one that really doesn't go around. I guess technically Fortnite, the most popular game at the moment, is a third-person shooter, which is also based on Gears of War. And I don't think anyone calls it a first-person shooter. They all call it a battle royale, which is hilarious because that main mode for the game isn't even the most popular aspect of it. I mean, they're trying to do everything in that game, which is really crazy. They have mini games and kart racing, and just instead of making a brand new game, they just add more games to that one. It's a very interesting chimera of a game. It's very mind-boggling. And yeah, so you have all the different shooter types, and third-person shooter it doesn't really exist as a genre because there's so many different ways you could do it that sometimes shooting will be incorporated and it'll just be an action game. Things like Killer is Dead, you have a firearm, but that's not the main aspect of the game. It's really melee combat. And so it kind of becomes an odd point where you say, well, if the main action is a certain type of action, then does it become that? For example, if you have a hack and slash kind of game, and I guess some people have referred to hack and slash as God of War, but really it's an action adventure game. But if you describe the action, it is hack and slash. It's a bunch of game where you're doing X and Y alternating combos. I don't know. I could not call God of War a hack and slash, but I might be able to call something like, well, then you have things like Kingdom Hearts, which some people have referred to as a button masher. So, I mean, they're both action adventure games, but when you drill down to that lower level, it then becomes a conversation of, well, what kind of action? I guess if it's a button masher, Kingdom Hearts, that means you're just spamming the same button over and over, but then you still have magic powers. But yeah, Kingdom Hearts is a very spammy game. Kratos and God of War, though, there's a bit more nuance, again, to the whole combo system, using your alt weapons. You could mash through it, but really it's hack and slash. Which, really, if you think about it, you have button mash, which is one button, and hack and slash, that's two buttons. XXX, YYY. That's kind of funny when you think about it. And so I started thinking about certain genres and how they could possibly exist. So, for example, Rogue, which is a game I've never played, but as I understand, it has a rogue-like quality to it. I think it'd be interesting to kind of offer some alternative ways. I really hate saying the word like, even though I've done it in this video and other videos many, many times, because I'm just flowing straight from my brain, but I really do want to stop doing that. And just the reinforcement of calling things a Souls-like or a rogue-like is difficult. And I think you could even, again, with all of these like games, you could redefine them. So, instead of saying a Zelda clone, you would say an action-adventure game. Instead of saying a Halo killer, you'd say an FPS. Instead of saying Oblivion with guns, you would say an RPG. Fallout is still an RPG. It's a role-playing FPS game. And Rogue is, well, that's hard to do because it really is kind of one of a kind. But there are some alternatives. You could say rogue-like, you could say rogue style, or you could say rogue form. So there are different ways to describe when you're just doing a alliteration or alliteration to another game. And it's really hard to do that to a game that technically, was the first of this genre, but no one really played it. Like, I don't know anyone who played or taught or even breathed the word rogue as a game other than as a useful reference to describe what this is. So I feel like this is some like Redditor who find, well, technically this is the first game that did it. Yeah, okay, well, great technically, but if we were to redefine the term rogue, we could call it a restart game. Well, what are you doing? You're restarting every time you die, so it's a restarter. or a restart game. Let's see if this works. Hades is a action restart game. I kind of like the sound of that. It doesn't. It kind of gets the point across without having to allude to another game that no one else has ever played in their entire life. So, yeah, I think restart kind of gets the point across. I was going to do maybe a reset game. I think reset game actually sounds even better. That's shorter, crisper, action reset game. I like that actually, and I just came up with that on the spot. I didn't write that one down. Yeah, action reset game. What else is Go Mecha Ball? Pretty fun game. That is an action reset game, or a reset game. Yeah, and that's the same R word, so you can just replace rogue with reset if you want. Because again, we're talking about the verbiage and the action that the player is taking, rather than just saying, "Oh, what's like that thing?" Well, what's rogue like? I mean, what is rogue actually like? It's a reset game. And if Rogue is a reset game, then every other Rogue game is a reset game. Anyway, there we go. We're making progress. We're improving society, civilization somewhat by redefining video game genres. So I had some interesting ones here that me and a friend went through. So Valkyria Chronicles, that's obviously a strategy game. You're moving around the environment. Yes, it's a third-person shooter. Yes, you can move things around on the map and you can attack things, but ultimately your characters are being placed in a pseudo time-locked system. So I think it's hard to say. If you're in a time-locked system, I guess it's a strategy game. And then RPGs take up a lot of it, so I guess technically a lot of RPGs are also strategy games, and then you have real-time strategy games like Age of Empires, Empire Earth, etc., StarCraft, where you still have that top-down view, and you can control systems and units individually or en masse. So I think that would still fill out. Here's a really interesting one. I was trying to think of for example, they sometimes call earlier platformers, or that's not a whole other conversation, platformers, but things like Banjo-Kazooie, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank are called collectathons. A better example is actually Spyro the Dragon, right? Because you explore the world and discover things, but the main objective is to get all the gems. That is the main goal of the game. Like, they stole the gems, we have to get it back. And so for that game, it's a collector game. I mean, the term they use is collectathon, but if we're using the proper verbiage for, action adventure, you are a collector game. And that aspect of the game is focusing on the discovery component, that you're going somewhere and you're collecting something, but it's that surprise of exploring the environment. So I don't think there's any. So again, if we were to take the building blocks of some of the best games, you have exploration, discovery, combat, melee or shooter, and then things beyond that. But if you were to take this imaginary pyramid, if you take the bottom rung and you have just exploration, you have something like a walking sim. And I thought of this, it's really dumb to call anything a walking sim, because the only walking sim that actually only walking simulator that exists is QWOP. And for those of you who haven't played QWOP, you are literally simulating the aspect of walking that is intentionally extremely deranged and very amusing to see. And so you're trying to contort the entire body using all the key bindings and whatever. That's the only actual walking simulator. When we talk about games like the Stanley Parable, a good game in my opinion, and even to games like Gone Home, I would say those games are exploration games. I think that is, frankly, it's a better marketing term. It sounds better, and I think it's more accurate that you are exploring an environment. You might discover things, or it just might be voiceover and dialogue. If it's just dialogue, in that case, yeah, I wouldn't say that is part of a discovery process. I would say that is the bottom rung of exploration. So, games where... but then again, what about games like Journey, where, yes, you're exploring an environment, but you also have puzzles. So, that doesn't have the discovery component, but I guess Journey might also technically fall into the category of a exploration only game or an exploration game. There is some combat, but not really. But I think Journey is, I guess, one game that is actually so good. I don't think of it as something as lowly as a walking simulator. Technically, it is though, but it's an exploration game. Really, Journey's an experience. It really, I mean, every game is supposed to be an experience. The music, the setting, the visuals, everything. Okay, so we have that. So there's exploration, and then you have discovery. And so I thought about this in a weird way. Is it possible to have a game that is only discovery, that is only about collecting? And I thought Spyro is a good contender for that. But then I just, wait, hold a second. There's a whole combat component of Spyro that, yes, okay, the main aspect is collecting, but it really is an action-adventure game. You have multiple levels that you can go through, not through a menu, but through the actual in-game balloon. So there's a reason why why Spyro can navigate there. And so it's an action-adventure game with a focus on collection. And so I thought, well, is it possible that there is, and the action part is that, of course, he can attack enemies, and using his fire and his charge attack, two very simple moves that both feel really, really good for a game made in that era. By the way, even like recently, they both justify the action component. If you can defeat enemies, then it's like, okay, well, I guess that counts. So I tried to think of a game that was only collectible, only discovery, and I couldn't think of one until I came up with it. And you know what it is? It's Katamari Damacy. And I thought, oh my god, only something as insane as that game, where the entire aspect of the game is, yeah, there's a bit of an adventure aspect as you go around the level, but really it's about collecting. And I would think, only the most lowliest degenerate game would kind of imbue you with a bunch of points and items and collectibles that would appeal to the lowest common denominator. But really, when you look at Katamari, it's just so insane and crazy that someone thought, yeah, this is going to be a cool. There are some other ones here. Still, I kind of debate if Resident Evil is a survival horror game, because again, as I said, the whole horror aspect, that's just a setting and a tone. You could say it's a survival sci-fi game, I guess, or other kind of things like this is more of a movie thing, right? So you could have survival horror, you could have survival sci-fi, you could have survival documentary, you could have survival action, which actually sounds very accurate. You could have survival French film. I actually I can't think of it. But yeah, there's that. But really, if you think about it, Resident Evil without the survival aspect, if you had a lot of items, it'd be an action adventure game. And it's just that survival component that makes it slightly different. But really, the survival aspect is just a type of adventure you're going on. Just to describe the action, it describes the adventure, that you just have limited resources. But still, overall, if you were to sit down and look at the overall aspect of it, it feels like an action-adventure game. Devil May Cry, action, obviously. Cooking Mama, this one was a bit difficult because, yes, you're doing a cooking mini game. It doesn't appear to be real life, but I kind of said it's more of a simulator because you're not, I guess you're kind of technically building something, and it's not a survival game for sure. So, and it's not a sandbox game because you have to just follow instructions. So I said it's more of a simulator where you, similar to Power Washing Simulator or Microsoft Air Flight Simulator, you have a certain objective, fly here, do this, and it's like checking off a bunch of boxes. So Cooking Mama, I kind of felt, even though it's very cartoony, it feels more like a simulator than anything else. Oh yeah, here's the other one where I got into a weird part where there's another genre where you have certain games where there's no enemies, no exploration, and it is kind of like a sandbox, but you still are somewhat limited in what you can do. And so I would say that would be The Sims. So in The Sims, I mean that's kind of hard to say because The Sims you can do a lot of stuff, but you can't. I mean, I don't know. Actually, you could do a lot of stuff in The Sims. I guess The Sims is technically a sandbox game, but what I wanted to call it is, well, what are you really doing? And maybe this is another term for sandbox, but I called it a management game. This is the game where you have total foresight, oversight of your characters, your population, etc., and you are just managing the characters and functions and operations within it. I first heard this term when you had the Fallout phone app or the phone game where you had Fallout, was it Fallout Shelter? Yeah. And you just, all the little characters would do their own thing. You didn't have to directly order them to do anything. They would have their own actions and you only change them at certain points. And so I find these non-combat, non-exploration, non-discovery games are management games, sandbox or management, and usually it would make sense that sandbox and management would go hand in hand, because if you can't build new things and you're just managing the same things you start out with, that would get really boring. Another thing that I thought of is that FNAF, coming back to FNAF. So, okay, I called it a jump scare game, which is technically, it's not actually what the player is doing. The player is managing resources, so it's a survival game, but it's also knowing the avenues and looking at the camera. And so I forgot that I actually described FNAF as a strategy game. It's not turn-based, there's no time limit, but I guess you have to manage your power and your energy and also all these different aspects. So in a way, it's like a survival strategy game, kind of. I think that defines FNAF pretty well. Then you have Death Stranding, and I thought, well, Death Stranding, that's obviously a walking simulator. You're transporting things from like A to B, place to place. But then I remembered, oh wait, there are actually gunfights, and while the emphasis is literally on walking, it's not simulating it. It's trying to make it very dynamic and interesting, because you have ladders and zip lines and roads and bridges. And ultimately, despite all the kind of non-combat focus of most of the game, I kind of defined it as an action-adventure game. And really, honestly, a lot of these games are action-adventure games. I wouldn't call it a sandbox, though, because even though you can technically build anything anywhere, the reason that you'd ever build anything is for a specific purpose, that there are streamlined missions that you do have to. Yeah, Journey is an adventure game, yeah. Then I had the other one. This one's kind of difficult. Mario Party. And this is another term you hear. It's very small amount, but it's called, a party game. It's like, well, you look at a game like Super Smash Brothers, and Super Smash Brothers is interesting because, like other fighting games that's stuck on a 2D plane that are played at very high competitive tournaments, that is a fighting game, but at the same time, it's based on a more multiplayer friendly focused environment, more aerial abilities, and really it's also a party game in a weird way. And the question is, what is a party game? Is if anything with local multiplayer a party game? Well, Mario Kart, no, that's a racer, obviously. So you have a combat, a fighting game, and technically all fighting games are action games because you're fighting someone else. It has a very specific genre and archetype that you could call it a fighting game, which means it's a certain type of action game. And again, because the whole game, the environments, there's really no discovery, no adventure. You're not going to go looking around the map. It's just there for two guys to beat the crap out of each other. And in Smash Brothers, it adds in items, it adds in so many new things that you can't really just call it an action game or a fighting game, because it has so many different aspects that are in the game that it makes it a very kind of different thing. And I think a party game is the only thing you could call it. Mario Party is also an interesting example because, again, it's non-combat. There is adventure and kind of discovery, but it's also competitive. So when you introduce the multiplayer component, I think it changes the aspect of how the actions of a game are perceived and the expectations. I know one really weird quick example is that games like Lethal Company, if you played them by yourself, or these multiplayer games like SCP, it would be kind of, whatever. That would be okay. That's a horror game or something, or a survival game. But as soon as you as soon as you add mics and someone else on the line when you're playing these games, it becomes immediately funny. I don't know what it is. I was playing Dead Space 3 and we could talk to each other, and I just realized, oh, this is not scary at all anymore. When you literally have someone on the phone, you actually get much less scared. I wonder if that's why 911 operators tell them to stay on the line so they calm down. So yeah, party game, it's a very hard to pin down idea, but the idea is that a bunch of people can come and play something locally and also not have to worry about a huge skill gap or skill ceiling. It's a very weird thing because every game is technically a party game. I mean, it's fun, but is every multiplayer game a party game? I don't think so. I mean, things like GoldenEye, that'd be a first-person shooter. I don't know. That one's kind of one I never really fully pinned down. Another genre, of course, is rhythm game. So rhythm games are, well, I mean, the rhythm games, and I suck at them. That's only the thing. That's the only thing I know. The one cool thing about rhythm games, though, is that in recent years I've seen things like Crypt of the Necromancer, the Legend of Zelda spinoff of that, Gunmetal Hellsinger, I think it's called. Where you combine the rhythm aspect with action and combat. I think it's a very cool combination. I just really suck at those games, and it really frustrates me. Of course, Tango Gameworks, Hi-Fi Rush. That also used it's a rhythm action game. It's a new genre where they just threw two things together and they made something really. Yeah. Here's another thing I kind of had an existential question about the question of sports games. Are sports games action games? Well, I mean, you are competing against other players. It's not really a party game. It's competitive. It's really hard to pin down, but I said technically there's one thing that does describe sports games, and it also describes the connotative feeling that I have for sports games, my disdain for them, is that they're simulators. You are just simulating a real life event that you could be doing right now. I could go outside and play soccer or hockey or basketball. Why would I want a game to do that? And I understand FIFA is a huge, huge deal and makes a lot of money from normal people, I guess. But for me, it actually boggles my mind. I don't understand why anyone would play a sport game that isn't something like Mario Tennis or Mario Strikers or some weird different version of it, because it's just the exact same thing but on a game console. It really is a barrier. But whatever. Oh, and then we had other games where, for example, like Riven. Riven, the focus of it is really a puzzle game, but to call something just a puzzle game is a bit, I don't know, difficult. There's very few games where it's just puzzles without also trying to tell you a story. And even in Riven, you can explore the environment. So it's also an adventure game. And really the adventure, the action adventure pinnacles here are kind of absorbing all of the other aspects of gameplay, which is combat and non-combat. And so yeah, Riven is a very straight line adventure game, but with an emphasis on puzzles. So I guess you could call it a puzzle adventure game. But as I went through more and more and more of these, the intent from all of these games either filters down to action or adventure. That's really two genres or a combination of the two. Oh yeah, this was an interesting insight. No More Heroes 1 to No More Heroes 2. Again, because we established this idea that the world has to matter for an adventure game. There has to be exploration and discovery. And if you take out those two bottom rungs, well, from No More Heroes 1 to No More Heroes 2, No More Heroes 2, they completely scrapped the entire open world because, frankly, it was kind of broken, so it's understandable. But at least the open world existed in No More Heroes 1. And so now you're just getting around via menu. And so it's a really weird feeling where I could say No More Heroes 1 was an action adventure game, but No More Heroes 2, that's just an action game. I can't call it an adventure game because, yeah, okay, you go through the dungeons before the boss, but the hub world is completely done away with. And it's one of these edge cases where I really wasn't sure if I could define it as action adventure or action only or whatever. So that one was kind of an edge case. I mean, technically, you do have the levels before the boss where you explore them, so it's just the hub world that's missing. But really, those environments only exist for the purpose of having you fight in them. It's not for you to go and explore and look at a cool artifact or something. They just exist. And so that's why I'm kind of compelled, because then, you talk about something like Devil May Cry. Well, Devil May Cry is definitely an action game because those environments only exist for the enemies to live in them. But, and there is a story that's being told there, and everything's, done through menus. So it's kind of like, is No More Heroes 2 an action adventure, but Devil May Cry isn't? It's only an action game? It became kind of difficult, really, to hash this out. But yeah, it's probably just overthinking this very minute detail, but it's an interesting aspect to focus on, because if that's the case, then if a game lacks a hub world or a clean transition from level to level, the implication is that it's an action game if it lacks that ability. Even in Devil May Cry 4, for example, you backtrack through the entire second half of the game. You're just going backwards, basically, because they just wanted to recycle the maps, which is fine, frankly. But the issue there is that, again, they're all separated by mission menu screens. In a real adventure game, I think what would be the main difference, like Mother 3, is that you can return to the same environment and go backwards and find stuff, buy stuff, get items, but the environment can change. And technically in Devil May Cry 4, the environment is changing, but only because you're in that certain level, because you're playing as Dante in the second half of the game. But if there was an ability for Nero to go back to a previous level and it changed, then that, I think, would constitute an adventure game. So again, we're hashing this out because we're getting very clear, distinct markers as to what is and isn't a certain thing. So if it has combat, it's an action game. If it has the ability to go in between levels and for the levels to change over time or at certain events rather than just loading in a certain mission, then that makes it an adventure game or an action adventure game. And there's also the aspect of, again, these kind of sub things or sub genres. So yeah, you have puzzle adventure games, or you could just say puzzle game, and people understand that's a type of adventure game. You could describe Zelda as a puzzle action game or puzzle action adventure, but it sounds weird. It's really an action adventure. I also like that AA connotation. But then you have games like Mass Effect. And Mass Effect, if you're to look at it without thinking, it's a third-person shooter. It's just like Gears of War, frankly. You're taking cover, chest-high walls, space setting, whatever, who cares, sci-fi. It's a sci-fi third-person shooter. Well, again, this is where it gets complicated, because if you look at Mass Effect 1, especially compared to Mass Effect 2, it was really, I mean, this is coming off the heels of the Knights of the Old Republic, which no one would argue that is an RPG. That is an action-adventure RPG, whatever, under that umbrella. But then Mass Effect comes along, and yeah, it has more action focus, but it still has those RPG elements. So Mass Effect 1, to me, feels like an RPG, but does Mass Effect 2 and 3 feel like an RPG? I mean, EA got involved. They focused more on action, reloadable clips, etc. I have no problem calling Mass Effect 1 an RPG, but calling Mass Effect 2 an RPG feels, I don't know, that feels a little bit off, a little bit odd. Where, okay, you might do your stats at the beginning, but the emphasis on special powers and stats, it doesn't really have that RPG element to it. I mean, you can create your character. So I think I would hold fast to it being an RPG, a sci-fi RPG, if you wanted to get specific throughout the series. But it just felt less and less like an actual RPG, and what was possible. And what was possible in the first few minutes of the game was possible throughout the whole thing. It doesn't matter what dialogue options you chose. This is the game you're getting. Oh yeah, then we talked about different kinds of shooters. So there's something like, so obviously your first person shooters like Doom, third person shooters, and then you have other kind of like on rail shooters, and the things like Star Fox, and then you have things like Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt might have been the first shooter that was absolutely stationary. There was no movement. You did not move as the player, but things on the environment move. And then you have things like MMO RPGs. Well, I mean, back in the day, World of Warcraft, that was the first massive multiplayer online game. And it's kind of weird that we say RPG, role-playing game, but we don't say MMOG, because, I mean, that's how you should say it. If you just say MMO, a massive multiplayer online what? Right? So you should say an MMO game or an MMO RPG, which is what World of Warcraft was. Those kinds of games are interesting because now everything is an MMO, technically. Everything has connection to the internet. Everything can support hundreds of players at once. So technically, the term MMO, I don't think you hear people use that anymore because it's redundant. It's saying character action game. I know it's a character. I know my character's doing actions. I know that the game is online and there's many people playing it. I get it. And I just think it's funny that we just say MMO and don't add the game part to it. But anyway, there's that. And then you get into the more esoteric genres where it's things like visual novels. And visual novels, you're not exploring. There's no discovery. There's no combat. You are just getting dialogue on a screen. It's like a text-based adventure, and without any choices sometimes. It is just a book. And so visual novels are the one genre of games that barely credit themselves as games. Because if it just was not an electronic format, like I could print out a visual novel. I could print out a video game on paper and it would be more or less the same. I think that'd be so funny if someone came to school or work or something, and because they couldn't download some visual novel, they screenshotted it and printed them off and so they could share it. I think that's such a funny idea. I hope someone does that someday. I mean, death to the trees, unfortunately, but I think it'd still be fun. Oh yeah, and then there were other games like Inscription is an interesting one, because Inscription, it's a card game, and I really do hate the card game genre. That's the one game that really changed my mind about it, because it's really a strategy adventure game. Because card games are derivation of the strategy genre. It's turn-based, but ultimately, you have what would I call? You have the ability to do to do time-based strategy. But also what's really cool that I like about Inscription is that it tells a story and has you explore a world. As small as it is, you are exploring a world. There's no discovery. Actually, no, there is discovery. I forgot. You can find these little things and there's puzzles to do. Okay, so yeah. So Inscription's a really good game. It's really, really cool. And so yeah, I'd say that would be a strategy adventure game, which is really interesting and weird. And it's very I don't know, it's very weird. I know, would Valkyria Chronicles be a strategy adventure game? Well, no. I mean, the maps exist for you to fight in them, but the maps in the game are in Inscription are for you to explore. So that's an interesting one. The one I really couldn't pin down though is, out of all these ones, is Frogger. Frogger, I mean, it's an adventure game in that you have to get to the other end, but the method by which you do that, the action by which you're taking is walking. So is Frogger a walking simulator? No, we already went through this. Is Frogger an exploration game? No, because you have a clear environment you have to get across. The game is so small, I really don't know how to define it, except that it's a frogging game. It's a strand type frogging game, and you play as Frogger. It's right in the title. I should have seen it. Of course, it's a Frogger type. Oh yeah, and I thought this was funny that sometimes if you want to describe another game by a game by another game standards, you could also just use the director. So you could call any game that's like Heavy Rain a cage-like, which I think is. And then you have talking about strategy action game or strategy. So while you have strategy adventure as a description, a strategy action game might be something like Pikmin. I mean, Pikmin really is. Technically, it's an RTS, but I think that'd be fine if we could call Pikmin an RTS. I'm trying to do this whole thing with a strategy action game, but that's an RTS. It's a real-time strategy action. Yeah, that's a real-time strategy game. I'm not going to expand on that. So yeah, that's kind of everything. And at the end of this, besides Frogger, which is the one frogging game, there is one other game that I was thinking about it, and it does not fit into any category. We've talked about action and adventure, the two kind of pinnacles, and how everything else falls down from that. On the adventure side, we have puzzle, exploration, collecting, and on action, we have nondescript, shooting, racing. Technically, might be considered an action game. It's the action you take. So those kind of fall into those two areas. The way that the character explores and interacts with the environment, and then the functions within the environment that happens between objects. So there's the contortion of the world, and then there's the effect on things in the world, which is kind of a weird. I'm trying to make this nuance, but I think that's kind of where we're kind of looking at these two different aspects and how they fall in. But there is one game that I simply could not fit into any category. I thought it's technically a racing game, but it also has an adventure quality to it, and it's kind of an action, which is not really racing. It's more like loop-de-looping. Look, it's Nights into Dreams. I have no idea what that game is about and what it's doing. I mean, you know what it's about, but you don't know what it's about. It's about a guy who goes into child's dreams because he wants them to not have nightmares, I think. But when you actually, for anyone who's actually played Nights, it's just a highly bizarre game. And it's a very bizarre concept from Sega where first of all, you start off as the kid, you walk around, you get hit by a bunch of like goblin things in your dreams, which you can't avoid. Then Night shows up and he has to gather up all your little gems. But the main gameplay, it's stuck on a 2D plane that's kind of rotating around the map. And you go through these loop-de-loops, and you fly through the air, and you have to, and like honestly, I don't know what I'm doing half the time when I play that game. So, Nights into Dreams, you win. That's the one game I have no idea. It's a racing game because there's a timer and you have to go through the loops, but you're not racing against anyone else. You just have to go through the environment, kind of like Sonic. Like Sonic's Sonic Adventure, that's an adventure game, and the levels are the action part. So Sonic is action adventure, usually, or just action if there's no hub world. So again, Sonic Adventure, it was called that because the adventure part is that you have seamless transition to all the worlds are connected. It has a hub world. And without the hub world, so Adventure 2, it kind of had a map, but then that kind of went away. And Sonic Heroes, it didn't have it just had level select. It didn't even have a map. They did not care about the world at all. So I would just say Sonic Heroes is more of an action game. Shadow is definitely an action game. But Sonic Adventure, even though Sonic Adventure 2 is in the name, I guess that's technically an adventure game. But no, it's not, because there's no hub world. You have a map, but that's it. Sonic Adventure 1 DX, that's an adventure game. All the other Sonic games, I would call them action games. And so Knights, I guess, is some kind of action game, and I don't know what it is. It's a dream action game. It's a dream-like. It's a Knights-like, guys. Knight style. Anyway, that's kind of my little rant and analysis and walkthrough of genres and what we can do and some feedback and just thinking about things. But yeah, I think genres are not really products of necessity. Well, sorry, they are products of necessity. They are products that are created. We're trying to use terms to describe things that are very abstract, and games are extremely abstract, and it's really hard to pin them down. And so we've struggled with it throughout the years, and I think maybe in the future we'll have different language to describe it. But I think using the verbs that the player is functioning and performing is a good place to start. And yeah, this was just fun to talk about, and that's it. I'll see you later, guys. Bye.